Imagine you are standing in the center of a forgotten nursery. The air is stale, thick with the scent of dry rot and old lavender, and the only light comes from the moon slicing through a boarded-up window. You aren't alone here. Sitting on a dusty shelf in the corner is a porcelain figure. Its dress is faded silk. Its skin is pale ceramic, but its eyes, glassy and unblinking, seem to catch the light in a way that feels impossibly organic. You take a step to the left, and you swear the eyes follow you. You hold your breath, waiting for a twitch of a finger or a shift in posture, fighting the primal lizard brain instinct that screams, "This object is a predator." This isn't just a toy, it is a vessel. For as long as humanity has shaped clay and carved wood into our own likeness, we have feared the moment the creation looks back at the creator. We abandon them in attics, we bury them in graves, and we leave them to rot in forests, but some dolls refuse to be forgotten. Tonight, we are peeling back the porcelain skin of history to reveal the stories of the dolls that didn't just mimic life, but seemingly consumed it. Welcome to the uncanny valley. Let's descend. To understand the true weight of a haunted effigy, we must look away from the polished shelves of collectors and turn our gaze toward the dark, murky canals of Xochimilco, just south of Mexico City. Here, the water is ancient, hiding secrets beneath layers of silt and tangled roots, and silence hangs heavy over the chinampas, or floating gardens. But on one specific plot of land, the silence is broken by the hollow gaze of 1,000 rotting eyes. This is La Isla de las Muñecas, the island of the dolls. The story does not begin with a ghost, but with a recluse named Don Julian Santana Barrera. In the mid-20th century, Julian left his wife and family behind to live a solitary life on this small island, seeking peace away from the crushing weight of civilization. But the canals of Xochimilco are not a place where one finds peace easily. They are a place where the past tends to float to the surface. According to local legend and Julian's own accounts, shortly after his arrival, he made a grim discovery. The body of a young girl had washed up on the shores of his island, drowned in the dark waters. Tragically, he was unable to save her. Shortly after her death, Julian saw something else floating in the exact same spot, a doll. Assuming it belonged to the deceased girl, he fished it out of the water. Driven by guilt, grief, or perhaps the beginning of a spiraling madness, Julian hung the doll from a tree as a sign of respect, a way to appease the restless spirit of the child he believed was now haunting his island. But one doll was not enough. Julian began to report whispers in the night, the sound of footsteps on the mud when no one was there, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. He became convinced that the girl's spirit was angry and that she demanded more company. Over the next 50 years, Don Julian scavenged dolls from trash heaps and fished them out of the canals. He didn't clean them. He didn't fix them. He hung them up exactly as he found them. Decapitated heads spiked on fences, limbless torsos swinging from branches, eyes missing, skin blistered by the sun. The island transformed into a macabre shrine. The dolls began to decay in ways that mimicked human decomposition. Their plastic skin greened with algae, spiders nested in their hollow eye sockets, and their hair became matted with dust and insects. Visitors who dared to approach the island reported that the dolls seemed to whisper to one another. Some claimed the eyes of the dolls would open and shut, or that their heads would turn to follow the boats passing through the canal. Julian himself spoke to them as if they were his children, or perhaps his jailers, protecting him from the spirit of the drowned girl while simultaneously trapping him in a nightmare of his own making. The story ends with a poetic, terrifying symmetry. In 2001, Don Julian Santana Barrera was found dead. His body was discovered floating in the canal, in the exact spot where he had reportedly found the drowned girl 5 decades earlier. Now the island remains, populated only by the rotting choir of dolls he left behind, their plastic hands swaying in the wind, eternally waiting for a master who will never return. While the island of the dolls presents a horror born of isolation and decay, some dolls do not need 50 years of rot to become terrifying. Sometimes the horror is pristine. Sometimes the evil is dressed in a crisp white sailor suit, sitting politely in a bedroom, waiting for the lights to go out. We leave the swamps of Mexico for the humid, storm-swept streets of Key West, Florida, where a boy and his best friend shared a bond that defied the laws of nature. In the early 1900s, the Otto family was prominent in Key West, living in a sprawling home known as the Artist House. But the center of this story is their young son, Robert Eugene Otto, known to his family as Gene. In 1904, Gene was given a doll. Standing 3 feet tall, stuffed with straw, and dressed in one of Gene's own childhood suits, the doll had a strange, blank face with small black eyes. Gene named the doll after himself, Robert. This was not a typical attachment between a child and a toy. Gene took Robert everywhere. He sat him at the dinner table, slept with him, and was often heard having long, hushed conversations with the doll in his bedroom. This would be innocent enough, were it not for the fact that his parents often heard a deep, unfamiliar voice answering him back. Strange phenomena began to plague the Otto household. Neighbors claimed that when the family was out, they could see Robert moving from window to window, watching the street. Servants would quit in terror, claiming the doll blinked or changed his expression when they entered the room. Inside the house, furniture would be overturned in the middle of the night. When Gene's parents would rush into his room to find him cowering in the corner amidst the wreckage, the boy's excuse was always the same, delivered with terrified conviction: Robert did it. Years passed, and Gene grew up. He became a successful artist, married, and inherited the house. But he never got rid of Robert. In fact, his attachment seemed to deepen. He built a special room for Robert in the turret of the house, complete with furniture sized for the doll. His wife, Anne, was reportedly disturbed by the doll's presence, feeling that the object held a malicious dominion over her husband. It is said that Gene's mood would darken whenever he was away from Robert, and the atmosphere in the house became suffocatingly heavy. Imagine for a moment being a guest in that house. You are sitting in the parlor, sipping tea, trying to ignore the feeling of dread dripping from the ceiling. You hear heavy footsteps in the attic room above you. Thud, thud, thud. You know Gene and his wife are sitting right in front of you. You look up, and you know, with a sickening certainty, that the thing pacing the floorboards upstairs does not have a heartbeat. After Gene died in 1974, the house was sold, and Robert was left behind in the attic. The new owner's 10-year-old daughter found him. It didn't take long before she began screaming in the night, claiming that Robert was moving around the room and had tried to attack her. Today, Robert resides in the East Martello Museum in Key West. He sits inside a glass case, clutching his very own toy lion. But the story hasn't ended. Museum staff report that cameras malfunction mysteriously when pointed at him. Electronic devices die. And perhaps most chillingly, visitors are warned to ask Robert's permission before taking his photograph. Those who mock him or take a picture without asking often write letters to the museum months later, begging for forgiveness. They describe a string of bad luck, car accidents, job losses, divorce, illness that they attribute to the curse of the doll. The museum walls are wallpapered with these letters of apology, a testament to the fact that while Gene Otto is long dead, Robert is very much awake. Robert represents a psychological terror, a doll that dominates the living. But in other cultures, the connection between a doll and the human soul is viewed through a lens of tragedy and biological impossibility. We travel now across the Pacific, to Japan, to a temple in Hokkaido, where a doll sits in a wooden box, harboring a secret that science struggles to explain. This is not a story of a curse, but of a soul refusing to leave its vessel. In 1918, a 17-year-old boy named Eikichi Suzuki purchased a doll for his 2-year-old sister, Okiku, while visiting the Sapporo Marine Exhibition. The doll was traditional and beautiful, standing about 16 inches tall, wearing a kimono with bobbed, jaw-length black hair and dark, obsidian eyes. Young Okiku loved the doll instantly. She named it after herself and played with it every single day. The two were inseparable, a pair of innocent spirits bound by play. Tragedy struck the following year when little Okiku fell ill with a severe fever and passed away. The family, devastated by the loss, placed her beloved doll on the family altar, praying to it daily in remembrance of their daughter. It was during these quiet moments of grief that they began to notice something impossible. When the doll was purchased, it had a traditional okappa, hairstyle: short, cropped specifically at the jawline. But as the months turned into years, the family noticed the hair was getting longer. The black strands were creeping past the jaw, touching the shoulders, and eventually reaching down toward the waist. The family believed that the spirit of little Okiku had taken residence within the doll, that her life force was continuing to grow even though her body had perished. In 1938, the family moved, but they felt it was not right to take the doll with them into a new, uncertain life. They entrusted the doll to the priests at the Manenji temple in Hokkaido, explaining the strange phenomenon. The priests accepted the doll with reverence. Over the decades, the hair has continued to grow. Reports suggest that the priests at the temple periodically trim the doll's hair, keeping it at knee length. It is said that when the hair is cut, it grows back. Even more unsettling are the claims that scientific analysis of the hair samples has revealed that the strands are not synthetic or animal fur, but human hair, specifically the hair of a young child. Visitors to the temple claim that if you look closely into the doll's half-open mouth, you can see growing teeth. The Okiku doll is not treated as a monster, but as a sacred mystery. It sits there today, a silent observer of the passage of time, its hair slowly lengthening, a biological anomaly that blurs the line between an inanimate object and a living being. It forces us to ask, if we pour enough love and grief into an object, do we give it a life of its own? Or is there something else, something opportunistic that slides into the empty shell when we aren't looking? The reverence shown to Okiku is a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding our next subject. While the Okiku doll sits in quiet contemplation, there are other dolls that seem to scream for attention. They don't just hold a spirit, they seem to hold a grudge. We move from the sacred temples of Japan to a small museum in British Columbia, Canada, where a doll named Mandy has been causing havoc for over 30 years. In 1991, a woman arrived at the Quesnel and District Museum carrying a bundle. She was visibly distressed. She told the curator, Ruth Stubbs, that she could no longer keep the antique doll in her home. She claimed that whenever the doll was in the house, she would hear the sound of a baby crying from the basement. When she would go to investigate, she would find the window open, even though she had nailed it shut. The doll, she said, was draining the life out of her family. The doll, known as Mandy, is a porcelain composition doll made in Germany or England around 1910. Her face is cracked and scarred, creating a permanent, fractured expression. Her clothes are original, but her body is soft, fragile cloth. The curator accepted the donation, perhaps skeptical of the ghost story, but captivated by the artifact. Almost immediately, the staff at the museum began to experience the same unexplainable phenomena. Lunches would disappear from the refrigerator and turn up tucked into drawers. Footsteps were heard when the building was locked and empty. Pens, books, and photos would go missing, only to reappear days later in places they couldn't possibly have fallen. But Mandy's interactions weren't limited to staff. She seemed to have a violent reaction to other dolls. When Mandy was placed in a display case with other antique dolls, the staff would arrive in the morning to find the other dolls knocked over, their limbs twisted, or pushed entirely off the shelves, while Mandy sat upright, perfectly composed, staring through the glass. It became so problematic that Mandy had to be given her own separate glass case, isolated from the others for their protection. Visitors report feeling a sudden drop in temperature when standing near her. Many claim that her eyes blink or follow them as they walk past. Video cameras often malfunction in her presence, batteries draining instantly. There is a palpable energy around her, a sense of a petulant, demanding child who acts out when she feels ignored. Unlike Robert, who demands respect, or Okiku, who commands reverence, Mandy seems to demand attention. The crack in her face serves as a visual metaphor for the fractured energy she emits, a broken thing that wants the world to feel its pain. She remains in the museum today, sitting alone in her case, a testament to the idea that sometimes you can't just give a doll away. You simply pass the haunting on to someone else. We have explored dolls that are possessed, cursed, or biologically anomalous. But to truly understand why we find these objects so eerie, we have to look at the history of how they were made and what they represented. There is a specific chapter in the history of doll making that is grim, not because of ghosts, but because of the harsh reality of death itself. Let us turn the clock back to the Victorian era, to a time when dolls weren't just toys, but warnings. The Victorian era was obsessed with death. With high infant mortality rates and a culture steeped in mourning rituals, death was a constant companion in the household. It is from this gray, fog-laden atmosphere that the frozen Charlotte dolls emerged. These dolls, popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were small, unglazed porcelain figures. They were molded as a single solid piece, limbs rigid, immovable, and often painted completely white. They cost pennies, making them incredibly popular, but their backstory is the stuff of nightmares. The name comes from a folk ballad titled Fair Charlotte, based on a poem by Seba Smith. The story tells of a young, vain girl named Charlotte, who is going to a ball on a sleigh ride with her sweetheart on a bitterly cold winter night. Charlotte, wanting to show off her beautiful dress, refuses to wrap herself in a blanket despite her fiancé's pleas. Throughout the journey, she speaks of the cold growing stronger, until finally her voice goes silent. When they arrive at the ball, her fiancé reaches out to help her down, only to find her sitting there, a frozen corpse, stiff and cold as stone. The dolls were manufactured to look like her, pale, rigid, and dead. Parents would buy these dolls for their children, often baking them into cakes or placing them in bathwater as floating toys. But the subtext was always there. These weren't just playthings, they were morality tales. Listen to your parents, dress warmly, or you will end up like frozen Charlotte. Consider the psychological impact of playing with a doll that explicitly represents a corpse. In the Victorian mind, the line between the doll and the dead child was perilously thin. Post-mortem photography was common, where parents would pose with their deceased children, often propping them up to look like dolls. Conversely, wax dolls were often placed in the graves of children who had died, acting as eternal playmates in the dark earth. There are verified reports of grave dolls being found during excavations, porcelain faces staring up from the dirt, unscathed by the worms that consumed the coffin and its occupant. These frozen Charlottes are perhaps the creepiest of all because they don't need to move or speak to terrify us. Their very design is an imitation of rigor mortis. They are reminders that the original purpose of the effigy was not to entertain, but to immortalize that which we have lost. We fill our homes with faces. We paint eyes onto plastic, we stitch smiles onto fabric, and we mold skin out of wax. We create these small silent companions to comfort our children, to stand as sentinels of innocence. But as we've seen tonight, from the rotting gardens of Mexico to the glass cases of Key West, these vessels are not always empty. Perhaps the reason we find abandoned dolls so terrifying is not because we think they are monsters, but because they are distorted reflections of ourselves. They have hands that cannot hold, legs that cannot walk, and eyes that see everything but register nothing. They outlive us. They sit in the dark long after the child has grown up, long after the house has been sold, long after the owner has died. So the next time you find yourself in an antique shop or cleaning out an old attic, and you lock eyes with a dusty porcelain figure, don't look away too quickly. Watch closely. Because while you might think you are just looking at a doll, the doll is almost certainly looking at you. And if you listen very carefully, you might just hear the faint, dry sound of porcelain sliding against wood. Sleep well. If you enjoyed peeling back the layers of this uncanny history, and you want to join us as we explore more of the world's darkest corners and unexplained mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are thousands of stories hiding in the shadows, and we are just getting started. Let me know in the comments. Would you ever keep a doll you found in an attic, or would you burn it on sight? I'll see you in the next video. Stay curious.